Imagine you're an architect, and someone hands you a blueprint of a city. You look for the streets first because that's how cities work. Streets connect everything. Streets are how people move, how goods travel, how neighborhoods breathe. You look at the blueprint again. There are no streets. Not hidden streets, not narrow alleys, not footpaths between buildings. Nothing, just a dense, packed mass of rectangular rooms pressed against each other, like cells in a honeycomb, spreading across a raised mound of earth in the middle of a flat Anatolian plain. And somehow, roughly 8,000 years ago, somewhere between 800 and 8,000 people lived there. This is Çatalhöyük, and right from the beginning, it refuses to make sense by any standard we're used to applying. If you're listening to this somewhere quiet tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I always check. It's one of my favourite parts of making these because it turns out there are people in Oslo at 2 in the morning and people in Sydney just starting their lunch break, all puzzling over the same ancient mystery at the same moment. That's something. Also, if you want to listen without ads or background music, I'm on Spotify, completely free, and following there is genuinely one of the best ways to support what I do. Link is in the description now. Back to that impossible city. Çatalhöyük sits in what is now south-central Turkey, in the Konya Plain, a broad flat basin that today looks mostly like dry farmland. But roughly 9,000 years ago, this region was wetter, more fertile, threaded through by seasonal rivers and wetlands. It was, in the language of the Neolithic world, a good place to stop. And people did stop there. They stopped for over 1,000 years. The site was occupied from approximately 7,100 BCE to around 6,000 BCE, give or take, depending on which layer you're looking at and which dating method you trust. That's not a village that got lucky for a generation or two. That's continuous, deliberate, multi-generational habitation in one place for more than 1,000 years. In an era when most human communities were still highly mobile, when people followed seasons and herds and didn't expect permanence, Çatalhöyük was something genuinely new. Or at least something that challenges what we think we know about what was new and when. What makes it so strange, so worth spending time with, is not just its age, it's the architecture. When archaeologists first began seriously excavating the site in the 1960s, and then again in a much more systematic way from the 1990s onward, they expected to find something that looked even loosely like a recognizable settlement. Markets, maybe, public spaces, some kind of central structure indicating leadership or organized religion. Streets, obviously. Cities need streets. There were none. The buildings at Çatalhöyük were constructed directly against each other, wall sharing wall, with no gaps between them wide enough to walk through. The settlement didn't grow outward from a centre the way modern cities do, spreading along arteries and boulevards. It grew upward and inward, with new buildings layered over old ones, generation stacked on generation, until the whole thing became a mound, a tell, rising up from the plain under its own accumulated history. People entered their homes not through doors in the walls, but through holes in the roofs, climbing down on wooden ladders into the rooms below. They walked across the tops of their neighbours' houses. The rooftop was the street. To modern eyes, that sounds almost fanciful, like something from a dream or a fiction about ancient times. But the archaeological evidence is clear on this point. There are no ground-level doorways in the domestic structures. The entry points are in the ceilings. The roofs were functional spaces, working surfaces where people moved and gathered and presumably did a great deal of the outdoor living that we might otherwise expect to happen at street level. And here's where it becomes important to say what archaeology can actually show us, and where interpretation takes over. The physical facts, the mud brick walls, the ladder holes, the hearths, the obsidian tools, the bones under the floors, these things are documented, excavated, measurable. what those facts meant to the people who lived there, why they built the way they built, whether it was choice or tradition or necessity or something else entirely, that remains genuinely open. Researchers disagree. Evidence points in multiple directions. And one of the things that makes Çatalhöyük so valuable as a site is that it rewards careful, humble thinking more than it rewards confident conclusions. What we can say with confidence is that this place challenges almost every assumption we carry about what cities are supposed to be and what they're supposed to do. We tend to think of urban planning as inseparable from hierarchy, from some authority deciding where the roads go, where the important buildings stand, where the ordinary people live in relation to the powerful ones. Çatalhöyük, at least on the surface, doesn't seem to have had that. The houses are strikingly similar to each other in size and construction. There is no obvious palace, no obvious temple complex set apart from the rest, no grand avenue leading to a seat of power. That absence is either deeply significant or deeply misleading, depending on how you read it. And over the next while, we're going to try to read it honestly, because there is something about a city with no streets that demands an explanation. It asks a question that the more you sit with it, the more interesting it becomes. Not just how did people live there, but why did they choose to live that way? And what does the answer tell us about what cities are actually for and what human beings are actually looking for when they decide to stay somewhere together and call it home? The story of how we found Çatalhöyük is almost as interesting as the site itself, and it's a useful reminder that archaeological knowledge doesn't arrive fully formed. It builds slowly, gets revised, sometimes gets torn down and rebuilt from scratch. The site didn't announce itself. It had been sitting in plain sight, a low hill rising from the Konya plain, for 9,000 years before anyone with a trowel paid it serious attention. James Mellerart, a British archaeologist, is the name most associated with the early discovery. He first noted the mound in 1958 during a survey of the region, recognized it as a significant tell, and began formal excavations in 1961. What he found over the next 4 seasons was extraordinary enough to put Çatalhöyük on the front pages of newspapers and the covers of popular magazines. Wall paintings, animal imagery, female figurines, dense layers of occupation reaching back to the 7th millennium BCE. Mellerart's instinct was that this was something genuinely important, and he was right about that. But the framework he used to make sense of it was shaped, as all frameworks are, by the assumptions of his moment. The early 1960s was a particular time in how Western archaeology thought about the ancient past. The concept of the Neolithic Revolution, first systematized by V. Gordon Childer in the 1930s, was still dominant. Childer had proposed that the shift from foraging to farming was the hinge point of human history, the moment that made everything else possible. Settled life, specialization, cities, writing civilization. In this framework, you were either looking for where civilization began or tracing the steps that led there. Çatalhöyük, sitting at around 7,100 BCE, felt like a missing link. It looked urban, it was large, it was old. Mellerart described it as a city, possibly the world's oldest, and that framing stuck for decades. It also, as it turned out, distorted the questions people brought to it. When you go into a site looking for the earliest city, you look for the things cities are supposed to have: a central authority, specialized religious buildings, evidence of social stratification, trade connections. Mellerart found some of what he was looking for, or thought he did. He interpreted certain rooms as shrines, dedicated spaces set apart from domestic life. He saw the female figurines as evidence of a goddess cult, a matriarchal religion centered on fertility and earth. He proposed that Çatalhöyük was a theocracy of sorts, organized around ritual and female spiritual power. It was a compelling narrative, vivid and coherent, and it entered popular culture with considerable force. The problem was that the evidence was thinner than the narrative suggested, and some of it was misread. Mellart's excavations ended in the late 1960s under complicated circumstances, and the site was quiet for a generation. When Ian Hodder, an archaeologist at Cambridge, led a new international research project beginning in 1993, he brought with him not just new tools and new funding, but a deliberately different philosophy. Where Mellart had moved through the site relatively quickly, Hodder's team moved slowly. Where Mellart had focused on the spectacular, Hodder's team focused on everything. And where Mellart had arrived with a framework and looked for evidence to fill it, Hodder's team tried, however imperfectly, to let the evidence shape the framework. This is harder than it sounds. Interpretation is unavoidable in archaeology. But the methods matter. To understand what the new excavations found and how they found it, you need to understand what Çatalhöyük actually is as a physical thing. It's a tell, which is a word borrowed from Arabic and used across the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean to describe a mound formed by long-term human occupation. Tells form because mud brick architecture, when it's abandoned or collapses, doesn't disappear cleanly. It softens, compresses, and becomes part of the ground. When people rebuild on the same spot, they build on top of that compressed debris. Generation by generation, the ground level rises. Over enough centuries, you end up with an artificial hill, sometimes dozens of meters high, made almost entirely of accumulated human history. Çatalhöyük's East Mound, the main occupation site, rises about 21 meters above the surrounding plain and covers roughly 13 hectares. It contains, depending on how you slice the stratigraphy, somewhere around 18 distinct occupation levels, each representing a period of use and abandonment, sometimes spanning just a few generations, sometimes longer. The layering is not incidental, it's the whole point, analytically speaking. Each level is a time capsule, sealed beneath later construction. The older layers preserve organic material, architectural details, and spatial relationships that would otherwise be lost to erosion, scavenging, and time. The way modern archaeology reads those layers is through stratigraphy, the careful documentation of which deposits sit above or below others, which walls cut through which earlier walls, which floors are sealed beneath which ceilings. Stratigraphy is the basic grammar of a site like this. It tells you the sequence of events even before you understand what the events were. But Hodder's team went considerably further than stratigraphy alone. They used micromorphology, which involves taking intact blocks of sediment from floors, hearths, and middens and examining them in thin section under a microscope. At that scale, you can see things invisible to the naked eye. The phytoliths from plant matter, the spherolites that form in animal dung, the charred particles that indicate fire, the trampled layers that tell you where people habitually walked. Micromorphology doesn't just tell you what was in a room. It can tell you how a room was used in what sequence, and sometimes how it was cleaned or maintained over time. They also sampled systematically for pollen, plant macrofossils, animal bone, and what are called residues, the organic traces left behind in pottery, on grinding stones, in the soil beneath hearths. Each category of evidence answers different questions. Bones tell you about diet and animal husbandry, and sometimes ritual behaviour. Plant remains tell you about agriculture, season, and what people were processing and eating. Residues can tell you what was stored in containers and what was burned in fires. And then there are the more immediately visible categories. Architecture, obviously the walls and floors and platforms and post holes and ladder holes. Artifacts, the tools and figurines and beads and pigment cakes. Pigment itself, the ochre and the mineral colours found in deposits and on walls. And human remains which at Çatalhöyük appear not in cemeteries but beneath the floors of houses, a fact that would eventually reshape almost everything about how people understood the site. What all of this adds up to is not a simple picture but a layered one. literally and figuratively. And context, the relationship between one piece of evidence and everything around it, turns out to matter enormously. An obsidian blade found in a trash deposit means something different from one found beneath a burial, which means something different from one found embedded in a plaster floor. The object is the same. The meaning depends entirely on where it was, what was near it, what was above and below it. This is why Mellart's early work, for all its genuine importance, left later researchers with frustrating gaps. Objects were removed without full contextual documentation. Rooms were excavated faster than the information around them could be captured. Some of what he described cannot be fully verified today because the evidence was moved before it could be properly recorded. It's not a criticism unique to Melart. It reflects the standards of his era. But it does mean that some of the most influential early claims about Çatalhöyük, the goddess shrines, the matriarchal religion, the ritual architecture, rest on a foundation that is softer than it looked. Hodder's team spent more than 2 decades at the site, through a research project that ran from 1993 to 2018, and the picture that emerged was more complicated and more interesting than the original narrative. The rooms Melart had called shrines turned out, on closer analysis, to be houses. Domestic spaces, yes, but also spaces where ritual activity happened, where animals were buried, where elaborate wall paintings were made and replastered and made again. The distinction between sacred space and domestic space that seemed obvious from a modern perspective turned out not to apply cleanly in Çatalhöyük at all. Ritual was happening inside ordinary homes. There was no clear separation. The female figurines, rather than indicating a widespread fertility goddess cult, appear across a much wider range of contexts than previously thought, some domestic, some depositional, some in ways that don't obviously connect to any single religious system. The evidence suggests many different practices rather than one unified belief. None of this makes the site less extraordinary. It makes it more honest. Çatalhöyük is not the world's oldest city in any rigorous sense of that term. It may not be a city at all, depending on how you define the word, which is actually one of the more interesting questions the site raises. It is a large, densely occupied, long-lived settlement that defies most of the categories we use to sort the ancient world. And the longer archaeologists have spent reading it carefully, the more those categories have started to look like our problem, not the site's. The mound has been patient. It has held its layers for 9,000 years. It will keep giving up information slowly, piece by piece, to people willing to ask questions carefully and sit with the uncertainty long enough to let the evidence speak first. To understand why anyone would build such a dense, streetless settlement, you have to zoom out from the mound itself and look at where it sits. Çatalhöyük lies in the Konya plain of central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. Today, when you stand there, you see a broad, flat, almost featureless expanse. Modern agriculture has levelled much of it. Irrigation channels cut straight lines across the fields. In summer, the air can shimmer with heat. It looks, at first glance, like the last place you'd expect to find one of the world's most famous Neolithic sites. But 9,000 years ago, at the beginning of the 7th millennium BCE, this plain was not what you see now. The early Holocene, the geological epoch we're still in, was a time of rising temperatures after the last ice age, but it wasn't a smooth, gentle climb. There were fluctuations, cooler pulses, wetter phases, drier intervals. In central Anatolia, that translated into a landscape that was more varied, and in some ways more generous, than today's semi-arid fields. The Konya Plain was part of an internal drainage basin. That means rivers didn't run off to the sea. They pooled and spread out into lakes and wetlands. In the Neolithic, several of these water bodies were much larger and more active than they are now. Just south of Çatalhöyük, there was a substantial marshy lake system, seasonally expanding and contracting, fed by meltwater and local streams. The mound was not sitting in the middle of a dry plain. It was perched near a dynamic wetland edge. From the point of view of early farmers and herders, that edge zone was a powerful attractor. Water in a semi-arid region is not just about drinking. It structures everything. Wetlands concentrate life. They draw in wild animals. They support reeds, sedges and other plants, useful for basketry, roofing and mats. They host fish and waterfowl. They create fertile floodplain soils nearby, refreshed by periodic flooding and sediment deposition. A short walk from wetter ground, you often find slightly higher, better drained patches suitable for building and for dryland crops. At Çatalhöyük, that seems to have been the pattern. Geoarchaeological studies, cores taken around the mound, thin sections of sediments examined under microscopes, show evidence of past wetland deposits, fluctuating water tables, and shifting channels. When the first inhabitants arrived, probably around 7,400–7,100 BCE, they were stepping into a mosaic landscape, patches of marsh, open water, seasonally damp flats, and slightly raised areas that stayed comparatively dry. To people still partly rooted in foraging lifeways, even as they experimented with cultivation and herding, such a mosaic was ideal. You didn't have to choose one subsistence strategy and abandon the rest. You could herd sheep and goats on the drier steppe edges. You could plant cereals in the better alluvial soils. You could collect wild plants, reeds, and bird eggs, and hunt wild cattle in the wetter margins. The environment allowed a plural economy. But that same richness came with instability. Wetlands move, channels shift course. Areas that are perfect for cultivation one decade can waterlog or salinize in another. In central Anatolia, the soils are not all equal. Some are deep and loamy. Others sit over calcareous subsoils that can turn hard and compact when dry. Some areas are prone to accumulating salts if water stagnates and then evaporates repeatedly. And the regional climate during the Neolithic, while generally warmer and wetter than today, still carried significant year-to-year and decade-to-decade variability. For a small group of households, that variability is a risk. A failed harvest, a dried-up water source, a disease outbreak among animals, any one of these can be catastrophic when your margin is thin. Çatalhöyük's location makes more sense when you think in terms of buffering that risk. By clustering near a large, relatively reliable wetland system, people were plugging themselves into a constant, if fluctuating, source of resources. When crops failed on the drier fields, fish or waterfowl might still be available. When grazing went bad in one direction, you could move herds toward another patch, still within reach of home. The wetlands themselves, although changeable, offered continuity across the years. They did not disappear overnight. Climate reconstructions for the early Holocene in this region suggest episodes of increased rainfall and episodes of drying, but no straightforward linear trend. Soils, vegetation zones, and water bodies all responded. Farmers at Çatalhöyük were dealing with a living, shifting system. Their decisions about what to plant, how many animals to keep, and where to send them to graze had to be tuned to those changes. This is where landscape archaeology becomes essential. The mound alone tells you how people built and rebuilt. The landscape around it tells you why they stayed and how they moved. Researchers have walked the Konya Plain with systematic survey methods, mapping artifact scatters, recording small satellite sites, and noting where obsidian flakes, pottery fragments, and animal bones turn up. They've combined that with remote sensing, geomorphological mapping, pollen from lake cores, and isotopic analysis of animal teeth and bones that can hint at where herds were grazing in different seasons. Put together, this creates a picture not just of a single mound, but of a web of movement. Animals from Çatalhöyük, for instance, show signatures suggesting that some herds were taken away from the immediate vicinity to graze, and then brought back. That implies knowledge of distant pasture, seasonal circuits across the plain, and a mental map that extended well beyond the visible edge of the mound. Obsidian, sourced by its chemical fingerprint, shows links up into Cappadocia and other volcanic zones hundreds of kilometers away. People at Çatalhöyük were not isolated villagers hugging a marsh. They were plugged into a broader landscape of exchange and mobility. Risk in that context isn't only environmental, it's also social. Who controls access to the best grazing land? Who can safely travel to distant resources? Who can call on allies if a drought hits one part of the plain harder than another? The physical environment sets the stage. Social strategies decide how that stage is used. One of the more intriguing questions, then, is whether the peculiar compactness of Çatalhöyük houses crammed wall-to-wall, no streets, access from the roofs, was primarily an environmental adaptation or primarily a cultural choice. You can imagine an environmental argument. If you want to maximize access to a particular resource zone like the edge of a wetland, maybe you compress your living space so that everyone can stay within convenient distance. Building densely on a slightly raised patch of ground might also be a pragmatic response to seasonal flooding or waterlogged soils nearby. Keep the houses together on the safe, dry island. Leave the lower, riskier areas to fields and grazing. You can also imagine a security argument. In an open plain, raiding of animals, stored grain, people is a perennial risk. A tightly packed settlement with controlled roof access presents a very different defensive profile from widely scattered farmsteads. But you can just as easily imagine the process running the other way. Perhaps for reasons of kinship, ritual, or a particular way of organizing households, the community developed a tradition of close, interlocking architecture. That tradition could then have influenced where they chose to live and how they read the landscape. Culture leading, environment following. It's difficult to prove either direction definitively. The evidence does show that other contemporary communities in central Anatolia and nearby regions did not all choose to build in such a compact way, even in broadly similar environments. That suggests that ecology alone doesn't dictate form. At the same time, Çatalhöyük's persistence over more than a millennium implies that its distinctive way of inhabiting space worked, at least well enough, in the specific setting of the Konya Plain. As we move onto the mound into the houses themselves, it's worth keeping this tension in mind. The rooms, the rooftops, the missing streets, all of them are embedded in a particular landscape of water, soil, and shifting risk. Whether that landscape pushed people to cluster tightly, or whether tightly clustered people learn to read the landscape in their own way, remains one of the quieter, unresolved questions behind those plastered walls. When you peel back the layers of that mound, what emerges first is not a palace or a temple, but a forest of rooms. A typical Çatalhöyük house, if there is such a thing, was a compact box of space defined by mud brick walls and carefully managed surfaces. Most of what we know comes from the later levels of the site, around 7,000–6,500 BCE, when the mound was already substantial and the building tradition well established. Imagine stepping carefully down from a roof ladder into one of these rooms. You would not find a central corridor or a lot of loose furniture. The interior was organized around built features. Along one side, often the north or east wall, there were raised platforms, benches of packed earth and mud brick coated in smooth white plaster. These platforms varied in height and size, but they dominated the living area. They were used for sitting, working, sleeping, and, as we'll see later, sometimes for burial. Against another wall, or toward a corner, you'd expect a hearth or an oven. These too were built up in relief from the floor. Domed ovens, open hearth basins, sometimes with a lip or low wall, usually with their own patch of bright plaster. Nearby, storage bins might be tucked into the available space, box-like constructions for keeping grain or other foodstuffs, sometimes plastered inside, sometimes left more rough. Very little of the floor was just empty, undifferentiated surface. Platforms, bins, hearths, and low partitions created a patterned landscape within a single small room. Access was from above, through the roof. The corners near the ladder opening, and the area directly under it, tend to be more churned up in the archaeological record, suggesting that people tried to step in and move around certain features while avoiding others. What ties all of this together is plaster. The people of Çatalhöyük plastered almost everything. Floors, platforms, lower wall zones, ovens, sometimes even the sides of storage bins. In many houses you can see layer upon layer of thin, lime-based plaster, applied, smoothed, and then at some point renewed. Count the layers carefully, and you can see cycles of maintenance. Plaster is patched, whitened, overlaid, cracks are filled in. Features are reshaped. This is not the architecture of a one-off building that stands until it collapses. It's the architecture of constant, low-level care, and that care extended into deeper cycles of renewal. Houses at Çatalhöyük were not just used and abandoned. They were frequently remodeled and, when they reached the end of their useful life, rebuilt on almost exactly the same footprint. Archaeologists talk about building sequences, a stack of similar rooms, one on top of the other, separated by demolition debris and levelling layers. A house might be in use for several decades, perhaps a couple of generations. Over that time, its walls might be thickened, its platforms reshaped, its hearth repositioned slightly. When it was finally taken out of use, the upper walls were pulled down into the interior. The space was filled and levelled, and a new house was built directly above. Door position, ladder location, platform layout, these were often repeated with striking fidelity. From the perspective of someone living there, house was not just the current set of walls and surfaces. It was a vertical lineage. People were literally living on top of the shells of earlier houses, which in turn contained the remains of earlier residents. The continuity of footprint and layout suggests that what mattered was not a street address in a grid or block, but the enduring identity of a household line tied to a particular patch of ground and a particular configuration of space. This is one of the most important clues to how social life was organized. In a lot of later urban traditions, our instinct is to look for neighborhoods, wards, or districts, clusters of houses forming a named quarter, served by some shared infrastructure or dominated by a public building. At Çatalhöyük, there is very little evidence for formally bounded neighborhoods or civic blocks divided by streets. Instead, we see units that repeat. House after house, each with its own internal platforms, hearths, bins, and crucially, its own history of rebuilding. Many researchers have argued that the primary social unit here was the house itself. That doesn't mean a nuclear family in the modern sense. A house could have contained several related adults, children, and perhaps more distant kin or co-residents. But the key organising principle seems to have been the continuity of a particular built space, and the people tied to it over time. Identities, rights to resources, ritual practices, all of these may have been anchored in the life history of specific houses. It's telling that when people renovated, they put so much effort into the surfaces. Plastering was not trivial work. Burning limestone to make lime plaster requires fuel and labour. Applying it in multiple thin coats, smoothing it, repainting or refinishing it. This is a recurring investment. Yet in many houses, we find dozens, sometimes over 100, distinct plaster layers on floors and platforms. That level of maintenance suggests a constant concern with cleanliness and order, or at least with the appearance of well-kept interiors. In a settlement where houses share party walls and there's very little open space between them, what happens inside one house has implications for its neighbours. Smoke, smells, pests, moisture all could spread laterally. Regular replastering would have helped seal cracks, smooth dirty or worn surfaces, and perhaps even manage insects or rodents. Bright, freshly whitened interiors might also have had symbolic or aesthetic importance linked to ideas of purity, propriety, or the right condition for everyday activities and rituals. The result is an environment where each house is like a cell in a densely packed tissue. From above, the site's plans show a honeycomb of adjoining rectangles. From within, each rectangle was a carefully bounded world, maintained through routine acts of cleaning, plastering, minor rebuilding, and periodic, more dramatic renewal. When a house was finally retired, it didn't simply vanish from social memory. It was entombed beneath its successor, its outline preserved and echoed. This repetitive, self-similar architecture creates another puzzle. When you look at dozens of houses with very similar layouts, platforms here, hearth there, storage, in roughly the same area, it is tempting to see an invisible planner behind them, someone dictating where things should go. But there is no clear evidence for a central authority imposing a blueprint. Instead, what the standardization seems to show is powerful shared norms. People knew collectively what a proper house should look like. They learned where to put the hearth, how to align the platforms, how high to build the walls, how often to renew the plaster. These choices were probably enforced not by officials but by expectations, by what neighbours did, by what elders said, by what counted as normal. The regularity of houses without obvious signs of top-down control is one of the features that makes Çatalhöyük so intriguing. It forces us to imagine a city-like density achieved through countless small decisions made at the household level, guided by tradition and mutual observation rather than laws carved in stone. In that sense, the mud brick boxes of Çatalhöyük are not just archaeological units. They are the visible traces of a social logic in which the house, its footprint, its surfaces, its maintenance routines, was the core framework for belonging. Once you see that, the lack of streets starts to feel less like an absence and more like a clue. If life was oriented inward, toward the platforms and hearths of each house, then the spaces between houses could be squeezed almost out of existence. Movement, access, and connection had to find other paths. To trace those paths, we have to climb back up to the roofs. If you stand back and look at the site plans of Çatalhöyük, especially for the best preserved levels around 7,000, 6,500 BCE, something jumps out immediately. There are almost no alleys. House rectangles press right up against one another, wall to wall, in big agglomerations. Where you might expect a network of lanes or courtyards at ground level, there are only a few narrow gaps, some small open spaces, and a handful of pathways that may have served as access routes. For a settlement that may have held several thousand people at its peak, this is unusual. This is what archaeologists mean when they say Çatalhöyük had no streets. They don't mean that nobody could move around. They mean that most of the circulation seems to have taken place somewhere else, on the roofs. The evidence for rooftop access and entry from above is surprisingly consistent. In many houses, the main breach in the ceiling is in a predictable area, usually over a corner near the hearth or oven. This opening is marked archaeologically by a dense zone of trampling ash and disturbance on the floor below, as though people were repeatedly climbing down and trying to avoid stepping on the platforms and built features. In the collapsed debris layers, archaeologists often find fragments of burned beams, roof plasters, and sometimes wooden elements that suggest a flat, load-bearing roof structure. These roofs were likely made of timber supports overlain with reeds and thick layers of packed earth and plaster. That kind of surface, if built well and maintained, can carry substantial weight. Some houses preserve diagnostic features that look very much like built-up surrounds or shoulders around a roof opening. In a few cases, impressions in the plaster hint at where a ladder might have leaned or rested. There are also distributions of soot and smoke blackening along upper wall zones that make the most sense if smoke from the hearth was drifting toward an opening in the roof, not out a side door. Put together, these clues point toward a typical pattern. You'd climb a ladder or steps on the outside of the house, walk across flat roofs, and then descend through a rectangular opening into the interior. If that's right, then the missing streets of Çatalhöyük weren't missing at all. They were simply elevated. Imagine the settlement not as a cluster of ground-level boxes, but as a continuous, slightly undulating roofscape. Some roofs a bit higher, some a bit lower, patched and replastered, with ladder mouths punctuating the surface. To move from one house to another, or from the edge of the mound toward its centre, you would stay on this upper plane, stepping around openings, ducking under low parapets, perhaps crossing narrow gaps with wooden planks. The ground between houses, where there was any, could be used for dumping, small-scale animal keeping or construction activities without needing to preserve clear passageways. Formal horizontal streets weren't necessary if your main circulation route was already up above. There are very practical advantages to such a system. Sanitation is one. Any large, dense settlement produces waste, organic refuse, broken tools, ash, and inevitably human excrement. If you tried to run lanes between every block of houses at ground level, they would quickly become dirty, crowded spaces that needed constant cleaning. By contrast, if traffic flows along the roofs, the cramped spaces between houses can be used more flexibly for dumping and filling in. Over time, rubbish and demolished building material help build up the mound itself. Animals are another factor. We know that by the later Neolithic levels, people at Çatalhöyük were herding sheep and goats and had some relationship with cattle, even if the exact balance between wild and domestic is still debated. Managing animals in tight ground-level lanes would be noisy and chaotic. Keeping circulation on the roofs leaves the lower margins of the settlement more open for pens, tethering and processing, away from the main flow of human movement. Security also improves when access is vertical. With no obvious street network penetrating the settlement, getting into the heart of Çatalhöyük meant knowing which roofs connected to which ladders and which narrow ground-level openings. Even if a stranger got to the outer walls, they would not find a big gate to walk through. Raising the movement network a story above the ground creates a kind of unwalled fortification. There could be thermal reasons as well. In a world of thick mud brick walls and packed earth roofs, the roof surface is a place where heat and airflow can be managed. Summer evenings might draw people upward, onto slightly breezier rooftops. Winter days, with low sun and local fires, could be more tolerable up top than down in damp, shaded alleys. Keeping the main movement corridor in the open air may have eased some of the problems of smoke and smell that come with indoor hearths. And then there is simple space efficiency. If you don't need to preserve broad ground-level streets, you can knit houses together like those cells in a tissue. That makes it easier to expand the mound horizontally as population grows, filling in gaps, adding new units on the edges of existing clusters. The cost is pushed upwards. People have to climb more ladders and walk more on the roofs, but the settlement can pack more households into a given footprint. All of this would have shaped social life. On a roof-connected settlement, much of the shared everyday contact happens on a common surface that also happens to be the tops of everyone's homes. It's easy to picture neighbours pausing by each other's roof openings, exchanging words, food or objects as someone emerges or descends. Children could run along familiar roof paths, supervised at a distance. Adults might spend parts of the day working on roofs, drying crops, repairing plaster, processing hides or fibres where there is light and air. At the same time, the threshold between public and private is very sharp. The moment you step off the roof and go down a ladder into a house, you cross into a bounded interior world of platforms, hearth and family history. There is no gentle transition through a front yard or porch or lane. You're either in the thick of the roof network, where anyone can see you moving, or inside, where thick walls separate you from all but the sounds of your neighbours. That sharp contrast may have reinforced the importance of the house as a social unit. Roofs connect households horizontally, but each ladder opening is a vertical boundary, controlled by the people who live below. Allowing someone to descend that ladder is an active choice. a small act of hospitality or obligation, rather than an automatic consequence of them walking down your street. Visibility works in interesting ways here. Out on the roofs you can probably see quite far, across clusters of houses, to other groups of roofs, maybe to fields and marshes beyond the mound. You know that other people are out there, moving along their own paths. But you don't see into their interiors unless invited. Privacy is thus spatially protected by default, even though the community is physically intertwined. Daily movement in a city like this would feel different from walking down a street with walls on either side. There is no single main avenue, no obvious square where pathways converge. Instead, there are many possible roof routes, some well-worn, others more private. Paths might be remembered and taught. The quickest way to the edge of the mound, the usual route to a particular ally's house, the safer track for elders or small children. Knowledge of these routes would be part of how you learn to inhabit the settlement. It's worth pausing, though, and noting how much of this picture depends on interpretation. Çatalhöyük is preserved as a mound of collapsed mud brick and fill. Roofs are gone. Wooden ladders, parapets, and external stairways have long since decayed. What survives best are wall lines, floor surfaces, and fills. When archaeologists reconstruct roofscapes and movement patterns, they are extrapolating from those fragments, from wear patterns on floors, from distributions of soot and debris, and from analogies with other traditional flat-roofed settlements. There is also the problem of preservation bias. Narrow ground-level paths, light fences, or small open yards between houses might leave very little archaeological trace after thousands of years of rebuilding, dumping, and erosion. Some small lanes do appear in the excavations, especially around the edges of house clusters, and it is likely that not every part of the settlement was equally packed. Certain areas may have had more open ground, more visible passages, or more conventional doorways. So when we say Çatalhöyük had no streets, it's more precise to say that it shows very few durable, planned ground-level thoroughfares relative to its size, and that the strongest evidence for movement and access points toward roofs and ladders. Within that framework, multiple versions of daily life are possible. Some scholars imagine a fairly calm rooftop environment, with regular but modest traffic, most people spending much of their time inside or on the immediate roof of their own house. Others picture a more bustling network, roofs almost like raised plazas and alleys, with a steady flow of people, things and animals along predictable routes. The truth may have shifted over time, varying with population density, season, and the evolving layout of the mound. Early levels might have been looser and more open, later ones more crowded and dependent on rooftop traffic. Specific house clusters may have developed their own microgeographies of access and avoidance. What remains consistent across these interpretations is the central insight. At Çatalhöyük, movement did not carve out broad, empty spaces between houses the way it does in many later cities. Instead, the priority seems to have been to preserve the integrity of houses and their sequences, to knit them tightly together, and to let circulation find a way through the third dimension over walls and down ladders, rather than by cutting lanes between them. That unusual choice, whether born of practical necessity, social preference, or both, set the stage for everything that happened inside those rooms. If most of life's comings and goings occurred on the roof, then what happened once you descended that ladder into firelight, smoke, and the close rhythms of the interior takes on an even deeper significance. When you climb down that ladder, the atmosphere changes immediately. Roofs are bright, open, and windy. Inside the house, the world narrows to a box of light, heat, and smell. Most houses at Çatalhöyük have a familiar internal arrangement. A main room, often carefully plastered, with raised platforms along the walls and a working area in the centre, or to one side. In that working area, there is almost always some kind of fire installation, a hearth, an oven, sometimes both, rebuilt many times on the same spot. These are not grand fireplaces. They're compact, practical features. Shallow basins, mud brick boxes, domed ovens. Many have thick, heat-reddened plaster and layered ash inside. Their edges are often crisp, suggesting they were kept in good repair, not allowed to crumble. In some houses, ovens are tucked near the ladder opening, perhaps to take advantage of the vertical draft. In others, the fire features sit closer to a wall, with smoke stains climbing upward. The problem they were solving every day is simple and relentless. How do you live, cook, and stay warm in a packed mud brick city without choking on your own smoke? The architecture does not provide chimney stacks in the modern sense. Instead, smoke had to find its way through small openings and through the porous edges of roofs and walls. Archaeologists see its traces as blackened plaster bands high on the walls and ceiling zones, most intense near where an opening to the roof is reconstructed. This suggests that the roof hatch doubled as a kind of vent. When the fire was lit, hot air and smoke rose and spread across the upper volume of the room. Some would drift toward the ladder opening and escape. Some would soak into the plaster, leaving that telltale soot. On still days, the interior may have filled with a low, hazy layer of smoke that sat above head height if you were seated on the platforms, but right in your face if you were standing to cook. This kind of environment shapes routine in subtle ways. You might crouch or sit low while tending a pot to keep your head under the worst of the smoke. You might plan the main cooking for certain times of day, when winds across the roof helped draw the smoke out, or when the house was otherwise less crowded. On cold days, when the house needed heating as much as cooking, people might tolerate thicker smoke, clustering closer to the hearth for warmth and light. Seasonal rhythm is built into this system. Mud brick and plaster have high thermal mass. They hold onto heat and cool slowly. In winter, a tightly sealed, windowless house with one or two carefully managed openings is an asset. A small fire can warm the core, and those raised platforms, sometimes with multiple layers of plaster, make good sleeping and sitting surfaces slightly above the cold floor. In summer, the same heavy walls and thick roof keep interiors relatively cool and dim, a refuge from glare and heat outside. Light levels inside would have been low for much of the year. Without windows, the main sources are the roof opening, the glow of the hearth, and perhaps small portable lamps fueled with animal fat. That means much indoor work was adapted to soft, diffuse illumination. Grinding grain on a quernstone, shaping clay, twisting fibres, nursing an infant, these can all be done in a circle of family on and around the platforms, with the brightest spot near the fire. Archaeologists trace these patterns through tiny residues, the micro-remains that gather in corners, on floor surfaces, and in the cracks of plaster. Under the microscope, a house floor is not flat. It's a layered record. Thin spreads of ash and charcoal, swept repeatedly toward particular edges, show where fires were cleaned and how thoroughly. Concentrations of phytoliths, silica bodies from plants, cluster around some hearths and benches, hinting at where reeds were processed, where cereal chaff was dumped, where fuel was stored or broken up. Wear patterns and chemical signatures help distinguish cleaner, respectable platforms, likely used for sitting and sleeping, from dirtier working zones. Certain platforms show very little burning, low levels of food-related residues, and repeated resurfacing with white plaster. Others bear stains of fats, traces of animal blood, or embedded bone splinters, marking zones where meat was cut or hides scraped. Even ash itself tells a story. Some houses preserve neat ash lenses, thin, flat layers of pale material trapped between plaster resurfacings. These look like intentional dumps, perhaps from sweeping the hearth and then sealing over the debris. Other areas have mixed, disturbed ash with trample marks, suggesting more hectic movement, perhaps near the ladder where people were constantly stepping. Put together, these micro-remains sketch a daily choreography, Someone rises before dawn or at first light from the roof opening. The hearth is rekindled from embers stored under ash or in a side pit. Smoke thickens, then thins as the fire gets going. Grain is brought over, poured into a hollowed stone and ground by hand, the grinding surface slowly polishing under years of circular motion. Children shift from sleeping platforms to the warmer spots by the fire, watched by an older sibling or grandparent, while adults tend to food or step up to the roof. Many crafts that leave small, hard-to-see traces would have fit comfortably into this interior world. Bead making from stone or shell produces tiny flakes and drilling dust, sometimes found clustered in corners or near platforms. Spinning fibres leave stray fibres and small concentrations of twisted fragments. Bone tool manufacture produces distinctive chips and polish patterns. The fact that archaeologists find these residues inside, rather than only in open spaces, suggests that a good deal of craft work was done within the house, often in the same room where people slept, ate, and told stories. Nighttime routines are less visible archaeologically, but the architecture hints at them. With the roof hatch closed or partly covered, the interior becomes even more enclosed. A small fire banked low could give a steady orange glow. Shadows of people on platforms, baskets stored under benches, wall paintings and installations catching the flicker of light. It's possible that certain activities, storytelling, quiet ritual, intimate conversation, clustered around these hours when the world narrowed to the shared warmth of a single room. Childcare must have been woven through all of this. The raised platforms act almost like built-in beds and benches, boundaries within an otherwise open rectangle. A toddler could be placed on a platform away from the hearth zone. Older children might help with small tasks, fetching fuel, sorting grains, while being constantly within sight and reach in a single, multi-use space. The lack of internal partitions in most houses means there are few truly separate rooms. Privacy, when it existed, was more about timing and posture than about doors. All of this indoor life depended on the careful balancing of fire and air. Too little fire, and the house is cold. Food remains raw. Insects and damp creep in. Too much, and the room fills with choking smoke. Surfaces blacken, plaster cracks. The soot bands, the gradual rise of floor levels as ash and debris are sealed under new surfaces, the repeated rebuilding of hearths and ovens, all point to continuous experimentation, small adjustments across generations to keep this balance workable. One unresolved question is how this interior world interacted with the rooftop one. Were roofs where most socializing and work happened, with interiors reserved for sleep, storage, and certain rituals? Or was indoor life primary, with the roof mainly a circulation route and seasonal workspace? The evidence points in both directions. Heavy craft residues and careful platform maintenance inside suggest rich interior use. But the need for light and fresh air, and the practical advantages of open space, make rooftop activity very likely as well. Çatalhöyük may have been a settlement where people moved constantly between two overlapping spheres, the dim, smoky, intensely personal interior of the house, and the brighter, breezier, more collective world of the roofscape. To understand how people fed this system, what they were baking in those ovens, boiling in those pots, and grinding on those stones, we have to step back outside again to the fields and herds that sustained the firelit rooms. When you step back from the glow of the hearth and imagine the settlement from a distance, Çatalhöyük stops being just a maze of rooms and ladders. It becomes an engine that has to be fed every single day. Several thousand people, generation after generation, in a place with winters cold enough to freeze mud bricks solid, and summers hot and dry. That kind of density does not survive on a handful of lucky hunting trips. It needs planning, storage, and a diet that, while it might not always be exciting, is predictable enough to hold the community together. The soil around the mound preserves that story in seeds, grains and microscopic plant remains. When archaeologists sift through the fills of abandoned rooms, middens between buildings and buried storage bins, they keep finding the same cast of characters: wheat and barley on the cereal side, lentils and peas on the legume side. These are not just wild grasses plucked here and there. The grains show morphological changes consistent with domestication: non-shattering ears, larger, more uniform seeds. The fields feeding Çatalhöyük were, by the 7th millennium BCE, managed landscapes. Alongside the cereal grains are other plant traces: seeds of wild plants, fruits, nuts, and the silica ghosts of reeds and grasses. This tells us that even as people committed to farming, they continued to forage. Riverine environments and wetlands nearby probably supplied rushes, sedges, and other useful plants for matting, baskets, and fuel. Wild fruits and nuts added seasonal variety and vitamins. The diet was not a simple monotone of porridge and flatbread. Animal bones complete the picture, but they do it in a complicated way. In the earliest levels, around 7,100–7,000 BCE, wild animals dominate the assemblages. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, red deer, wild boar, onager, and numerous smaller species appear in great numbers. Over time, though, the proportions shift. Sheep and goats become more common, and their age and sex profiles begin to look less like a wild hunted herd and more like an intentionally managed one. Many young males culled for meat, more females kept alive for milk and reproduction. Cattle are the slowest to change. For long stretches of Çatalhöyük's occupation, cattle bones still look like they come from big, powerful aurochs taken on the hunt, not small, docile house cows. Some researchers argue that true cattle domestication is only weakly visible at the site, or arrives late. Others see early signs of management in pathologies and herd structures. The consensus is cautious. People here were at least experimenting with control over cattle, but hunting large wild bulls remained an important and perhaps prestigious activity. This mixed economy matters for how a dense settlement manages risk. Domesticated cereals and legumes offer something hunting never can: a relatively predictable harvest. If you sow enough grain in enough plots, year after year, you can expect some yield even in poor seasons. Legumes help fix nitrogen, improving soil fertility and providing protein. Sheep and goats add a walking reserve of meat, milk, hair, and hides, animals that can be slaughtered or kept alive as conditions demand. But farming is also vulnerable. One bad drought, one outbreak of plant disease, one swarm of pests can threaten the staple base. In that situation, wild foods and hunting become a critical backup. You can't suddenly conjure a herd of aurochs from nothing, but if wild herds still move through the surrounding landscape, skilled hunters can try to compensate. Wetland plants, wild seeds, and gathered fruits can fill small but crucial gaps. Storage is where these strategies come together. Inside Çatalhöyük houses, archaeologists find bins, pits, and plastered compartments built into floors and platforms. Some of these features contain concentrations of charred grain and pulses, carbonized by accident, perhaps in a fire, and thus preserved for us. Others show chemical signatures of stored cereals even when no seeds remain. The pattern suggests that households kept significant reserves of food close at hand, within their living spaces. This kind of storage smooths out time. A good harvest can be turned into a buffer for lean years. Grain can be cleaned, dried, and sealed away in plastered bins. Legumes can be stored dry as well. Meat, more perishable, might be consumed fresh, dried, or rendered into fat. But animals on the hoof, herds of sheep and goats grazing out beyond the mound, are themselves a form of moving storage. In a settlement, this compact risk buffering probably wasn't just a private affair. Some houses hold more storage features than others. Some middens contain massive dumps of cereal processing waste, suggesting that certain households handled larger quantities of grain. This could indicate emerging differences in access and wealth, but it might also reflect cooperative strategies, extended families, pooling harvests, redistributing in times of shortage, or hosting feasts that converted stored grain and meat into social capital. Hunting weaves into this system in a different register. By the time Çatalhöyük is at its peak, domesticated foods are supplying much of the daily calories. But hunting does not fade away as a quaint survival from the past. Wild animal bones, especially from large game, remain common. Horns and skull fragments of aurochs and deer are built into walls and platforms as installations. These are not just leftovers, they look like trophies, symbols, or offerings. Going out beyond the settled mound to track and kill a wild bull or stag may have carried social meaning well beyond the meat it provided. It could be a test of courage, a marker of group identity, a way to connect with ancestors or powerful forces imagined to inhabit the landscape and the animals themselves. In that sense, hunting continued to shape social life, even if its contribution to the diet slowly shrank relative to the fields and herds. Scientists can trace these balances at a surprisingly fine scale. Stable isotope analysis, measuring ratios of carbon and nitrogen in human and animal bones, helps estimate the proportion of plant versus animal protein and sometimes distinguish between different kinds of plants. At Çatalhöyük, isotope data suggest diets heavily based on cereals and legumes, with significant but varying amounts of animal protein. Different individuals show slightly different signatures, hinting at diversity in what people ate, perhaps by age, gender, or household tradition. Isotopes in animal bones tell us about mobility. Sheep and goats with varied strontium signatures may have grazed in different parts of the landscape, or moved seasonally. That suggests herding was not just a matter of keeping animals penned near the houses. It likely involved daily or seasonal journeys out into the plains and foothills, connecting the dense architectural world of the mound to a much wider economic territory. Seeds and plant micro-remains track cropping strategies. Changes through time in the proportion of weed species associated with different field conditions hint at shifting cultivation methods. Maybe more intensive plots close to the site at some times, more extensive use of outfields at others. Combined with the animal data, they point to a community constantly adjusting the mix, leaning more heavily on herding in some phases, on cereals and legumes in others, without ever completely abandoning foraging and hunting. All of this complicates the neat textbook story where farming replaces hunting, and villages follow a smooth, irreversible path toward fully agricultural life. Çatalhöyük sits right in the middle of that story chronologically, after the first experiments with cultivation in Southwest Asia, before the rise of clear-cut urban states. Yet what we see here is not a straight line from wild to domestic, from mobile to settled. It looks more like a braided stream, channels of farming, herding, gathering, and hunting splitting and rejoining, some thicker at certain moments, thinner at others. People here were not just dragged into agriculture by inevitability. They were constantly negotiating it, blending crops, herds, and wild resources into a flexible, if sometimes fragile, subsistence web. That web, in turn, shaped their houses, their storage, their calendars, and their sense of security. To see how they supported this way of life day by day, not just in the fields, but in the tools they used and the connections that reached far beyond the horizon, we have to look more closely at what they made with their hands and how far those objects could travel. If you could empty one house at Çatalhöyük of its dust and fill, and lay everything on the floor in front of you, the amount of stuff would probably be overwhelming. Cutting edges, grinding surfaces, sharp flakes, heavy slabs. Traces of woven containers that have long since decayed. Beads so tiny you could lose one in a breath. Together they form a second kind of landscape, one made not of mud brick and plaster, but of tools, ornaments, and the skills needed to keep them flowing. Some of the most striking objects are the obsidian blades. Obsidian is volcanic glass. When you strike it just right, it fractures into edges that are sharper than almost anything you can make from metal without modern technology. At Çatalhöyük, archaeologists find long, narrow blades and bladelets made from obsidian cores, often with exquisite regularity. These were the scalpels and razors of Neolithic life, for cutting hides, processing plants, shaping wood, maybe even for delicate surgery or tattooing. What makes them especially interesting is where the material comes from. There is no obsidian source under the mound itself. Chemical fingerprinting, comparing trace elements in the stone to known geological sources, links much of Çatalhöyük's obsidian to volcanoes in central Anatolia, like Gölü Dağı and Nenisi Dağı, over 100 kilometers away. Some pieces may come from even more distant sources. That means that by around 7,106,000 BCE, people living in this streetless city were somehow connected to quarries and flows far beyond their daily grazing circuits. The obsidian in a knife used to cut bread in one small plastered room might have started its life as a block of glass on the slope of an ancient volcano, carried or exchanged through many hands before ending up on a household floor. Obsidian wasn't the only material in play. Ground stone tools are everywhere in the excavations. Querns and handstones for grinding grain, polishers, pounders, axes and adzes with carefully shaped edges. These are heavy objects, sometimes worn down through years of repetitive use. Many seem to have been made from local or regional stones selected for hardness and texture, then shaped and reshaped as they aged. The smooth hollows of grinding stones are the fossilized movements of thousands of meals. Then there are the things that rarely survive, but leave ghosts. Basketry and textiles almost never preserve in open-air Neolithic sites. At Çatalhöyük, what we mostly see are impressions, patterns pressed accidentally into wet clay or plaster by baskets used as moulds, by mats laid down before a floor was finished, by bags that once held grain or clay and left their weave behind. Some fired clay pieces also preserve negative impressions of fibres that burned away in the kiln. From these faint traces, researchers can infer surprisingly sophisticated weaving and plaiting techniques. Different weave structures suggest that people were making not just rough carriers, but finely worked mats, bags, and perhaps clothing. The material might have been plant fibres, animal hair, or a mix. It hints at a world of flexible, colourful objects that filled the gaps between the harder, more archaeologically visible tools. Adorning the people who used all of this were beads and ornaments. Beads made from shell, stone, bone, and sometimes imported materials show up in house floors, in midden deposits, and in burials beneath platforms. Some are roughly made, others are drilled and shaped with precision, strung into necklaces or sewn onto clothing. Their raw materials can sometimes be traced. Certain marine shells at Çatalhöyük likely come from the Mediterranean or the Aegean, far to the west. Others may derive from more local freshwater sources. Put all of this together, and the site begins to look like a node in a web, rather than an isolated island. Obsidian moving in from the volcanic heart of Anatolia, shells trickling in from distant coasts, perhaps pigments, timber, fine stone, or finished ornaments arriving along similar paths, and moving out again, grain, animal products, crafted goods, or simply the promise of future cooperation. None of this requires caravans organised by kings or merchants in the later sense. It can be built from many small exchanges repeated over generations. Archaeologists debate how specialised production was at Çatalhöyük. On the one hand, most tools and ornaments are found inside houses, not in clear, separate workshops. Many households show evidence for knapping stone, grinding pigment, shaping bone, working clay. That suggests a largely household-based craft economy. Families producing most of what they needed, sharing skills across generations, with expertise embedded in everyday life, rather than locked away with a distinct artisan class. On the other hand, patterns emerge in the details. Some buildings contain unusually large quantities of certain materials or concentrations of high-quality tools and debitage, waste flakes from tool production. A few show repeated evidence of particular activities like intense obsidian working or specialized bead drilling. These might have been places where especially skilled individuals lived and worked, producing for others as well as themselves. But even if there were specialists, they seem to have been woven into the domestic fabric rather than standing apart in separate industrial zones. This is important for how we think about trade without states. Later in history, long-distance exchange is often tied to formal markets, currencies, official weights and measures, and powerful institutions that regulate and tax the flow of goods. At Çatalhöyük, there is no sign of that machinery. Yet the presence of non-local materials and the consistency of certain technological traditions show that ideas and objects moved across surprisingly wide areas. Trade here may have looked more like a chain of relationships than a marketplace. Herders meeting other groups on seasonal pastures and swapping obsidian cores for hides, visitors arriving for gatherings or rituals and bringing shells or pigments as gifts, marriage partners moving between communities and carrying personal ornaments, stories, and craft techniques with them. Over time, these small-scale exchanges could link valleys, plains, and coasts into a loose but resilient network. Did those connections shape how people at Çatalhöyük thought of themselves? That is harder to see. It is possible that wearing a certain style of bead or using obsidian from a particular source signaled membership in a broader identity, a clan, a ritual community, a region-spanning alliance. It is equally possible that most of these exchanges were framed in very practical terms, a way to get good cutting stone, pretty shells, or a bit of news about distant herds. The truth may lie somewhere between. Objects can be both useful and meaningful at the same time. A blade is a tool, but the fact that it comes from a far-off mountain could also carry stories, memories, or a sense of connection to people who live beyond the horizon. A shell bead can simply be pretty, or it can remind you that your grandmother's kin live where the sea meets the land. What we can say is that Çatalhöyük's dense architecture and intense local life did not cut it off from the wider world. If anything, the tools, crafts, and ornaments suggest the opposite. A community deeply engaged in making things with its own hands, and equally capable of reaching out along invisible paths of exchange and relationship. Those paths, in turn, ran through the same rooms where people slept, cooked, and remembered their dead. To see just how closely everyday life, ancestry, and meaning were entangled, we have to look down beneath the very floors on which all this crafting took place. If you could peel back the plaster platforms in a Çatalhöyük house, layer by layer, the room would slowly fill up with people. Not living people, but the tightly flexed bodies of those who once lived there. One of the most distinctive practices at Çatalhöyük is that many of the dead were buried right under the floors and platforms of the houses, often under the main raised platforms where people sat, worked, and slept. In some cases there are single burials. In others, clusters, a small cemetery stacked vertically beneath a favourite sleeping place. Bodies were usually placed in a tightly crouched position, knees drawn up, often on their side. Sometimes they were wrapped in textiles or mats, or placed in something like a bundle that has long since decayed, leaving only the posture and the compactness as clues. The grave pits were cut down through earlier floors, the person laid inside, then the pits sealed and reblasted so that, very quickly, the surface looked like a simple, clean platform again. From then on, daily life continued above them. People ground grain, knapped obsidian, gave birth, told stories, and slept literally on top of their dead. To get from there to any kind of meaning, archaeologists have to start with the bodies themselves. Bioarchaeology, the study of human remains in archaeological contexts, can extract a surprising amount of information from these quiet skeletons. Teeth and pelvis shapes help estimate age and sex. Lines in tooth enamel can mark childhood stress episodes, times of illness or hunger when normal growth was interrupted. Bone thickness and joint wear can hint at habitual activities, repetitive kneeling, heavy lifting, long-distance walking. Signs of trauma also show up. Healed fractures on arms or ribs suggest accidents or interpersonal violence that did not kill the individual. Sharp force injuries or unhealed breaks might point to events that did. Patterns of arthritis and spinal changes can speak to a lifetime of grinding grain or carrying loads. Nutritional deficiencies leave subtle signatures in bone porosity and shape. At Çatalhöyük, these skeletal stories suggest a population that worked hard, lived in close quarters and experienced periodic stress, but also one in which many people survived injuries and lived into adulthood. Men and women often show overlapping patterns of wear, hinting that labour was widely shared. Children's remains show both vulnerability and care. Some die young, others show healed stresses that indicate they lived through serious early hardship. All of this makes the phrase living with the dead feel very literal and very grounded. But what did it mean to these people to have their dead in the house? The temptation is to reach for a single neat explanation: ancestor worship, household cult, a fixed belief system that we can name and describe. The evidence doesn't really line up in such a tidy way. On one level, burying the dead under the floor could be practical. There are no large obvious cemeteries set apart from the settlement. Keeping the dead inside houses might have been a way to manage space, to avoid scattering graves across valuable agricultural land, or to protect bodies from scavengers. In a dense, roof-access city, moving heavy bodies up ladders and across rooftops to some distant burial ground might simply not have been attractive. On another level, it clearly was not just about convenience. Some burials include beads, shells, or other ornaments, sometimes still around the neck or wrist. A few show traces of red ochre or other pigments applied to the body. In some cases, skulls appear to have been removed after the flesh decayed, suggesting secondary treatment and circulation of specific body parts. Later on, in a few houses, plastered or decorated skulls appear, though this is much more prominent in other Near Eastern sites than at Çatalhöyük itself. The key point is variation. Not every person was buried in exactly the same way, and not every house has the same burial pattern. Some buildings contain many burials under the main platforms. Others have only a few or none that have been found so far. Ages and sexes are mixed. Adults, children, sometimes infants are interred together, but the ratios are not identical from house to house. In a few cases there seems to be a correlation between buildings with rich wall paintings or elaborate installations and those with more or particular kinds of burials. In other cases that link is weak or absent. Some individuals are buried with many ornaments, others with none. Some graves appear to have been reopened, perhaps to retrieve a skull or to make space for another body, while others remain undisturbed. This unevenness matters because it hints that Çatalhöyük's mortuary practices were not governed by a simple, rigid rulebook. There may have been shared understandings about how to treat a body, crouched posture, wrapping, placement under platforms, but how many people were buried in a given house, who exactly qualified, and how much attention they received could all vary. One common interpretation is that these underfloor burials marked ancestry. In that view, the dead beneath a platform were the remembered kin of the people above. Their presence tied living households to a lineage, a story stretching back through time. Sleeping over your grandmother's grave could be more than sentimental. It could root your claim to belong in that space. Another line of thinking sees burials as anchoring property. In a mud brick city where houses were rebuilt again and again on the same footprints, where walls crumbled and were replastered, and physical structures blurred together over centuries. The dead might have served as enduring markers. If your ancestors are under this platform, this is your house, even if the visible architecture is on its 10th rebuild. The grave becomes a kind of legal document written in bone. Memory is harder to see, but just as important. Perhaps specific individuals were remembered by name, with stories retold as people sat on the platforms above. Perhaps others faded into a more generalized sense of our dead, still powerful but less distinct. The act of cutting through an earlier floor, encountering old bones, and carefully working around or with them to add a new burial could itself have been a moment of recollection and quiet ritual, whether or not there was a formal ceremony. It is also possible that not everyone who lived at Çatalhöyük ended up under a floor at all. Some individuals may have been buried elsewhere or disposed of in ways that leave little trace. If that is the case, then being chosen for an underfloor burial would have been a special status, not a universal fate, that could reflect age, achievements, social roles, or relationships we can only dimly infer. What we can say carefully is that these burials stitched houses, people and time together. Each platform became a layered archive, the latest sleeping mat on top, below it generations of plaster, and beneath that the tightly folded dead. Ancestry, property, memory, and everyday life were not separate domains. They occupied the same physical space, the same room, the same square meters of compacted earth, and above those quiet graves, the walls themselves began to carry marks of meaning. To see how the living chose to surround themselves with images and colour, we have to lift our eyes from the floor to the painted surfaces that rose around them. If you were to sit on one of those plaster platforms, with the dead quietly gathered beneath you, your gaze would land on surfaces that were anything but neutral. Many rooms at Çatalhöyük were plain, white or cream plaster, smoothed over and renewed again and again, softening corners and edges. But some rooms and some houses carry bursts of deliberate colour. Large patches of wall were painted with red, sometimes combined with black, or occasionally other tones. Geometric bands run along edges, chevrons, grids and panels that break up the flatness. In certain buildings, whole walls are taken over by more complex murals. Lines of animals, clusters of aurochs or deer, stylized human figures, scenes that might be hunts or perhaps something less literal and more symbolic. There are also abstract motifs, repeated handprints, dots, zigzags, layered shapes that do not resolve into recognizable scenes at all, but clearly are not random. All of this was done on plaster, and that detail turns out to matter. Çatalhöyük's walls and platforms were not static constructions. People replastered them regularly, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of times over the life of a building. Every fresh coat was a chance to erase or to renew. When we see a red panel or an animal scene, we are usually looking at just the latest visible layer in a long sequence. Beneath that image, archaeologists sometimes find earlier paintings, sealed away behind subsequent plasterings, like an archive of superseded meanings. The pigments themselves tell another part of the story. Red at Çatalhöyük typically comes from iron oxides, ochres, ground to fine powders, mixed with some kind of binder, and applied to damp or dry plaster. Black might come from charcoals or manganese compounds. There are hints of other colours in some contexts, yellows, perhaps traces of blue or green, though these are rarer and more fragile. None of this happens by accident. People had to locate pigment sources in the surrounding landscape, mine or collect them, crush and process them, and learn how they behaved on plaster under flickering indoor light. That takes planning, experimentation and practice. The painted surfaces also show evidence of maintenance. In some rooms, earlier designs were carefully covered, and replaced with new ones, suggesting that repainting was not just patching damage, but reworking the visual and perhaps symbolic environment of the house. Certain motifs recur over generations in the same building, as if a particular house carried its own favoured themes. Others appear once and vanish. So, what was all this painting for? One possibility is that some murals acted as a kind of storytelling. A row of charging aurochs with humans around them could map onto remembered hunts, or stories about how things ought to be done. In a community where hunting large wild animals still mattered alongside farming and herding images might help fix successful strategies in memory, or turn dangerous activities into shared narratives that children heard long before they were old enough to take part. Another interpretation sees teaching more broadly. Geometric patterns, repeated handprints, or rhythmically arranged shapes may have helped structure attention, mark certain zones of the room as special, or served as mnemonic tools. In a world without writing, visual repetition can anchor complex knowledge in very concrete cues. This is where we do this kind of work, or this corner is associated with these stories. It is also hard to escape the sense that some painting could signal status. Not every house is equally decorated. Some buildings, often the ones archaeologists have dubbed special or history houses, have dense concentrations of wall paintings, reliefs and installations. Others appear much plainer. That does not necessarily mean the inhabitants were higher in a rigid hierarchy, but it may suggest that certain households took on particular roles, hosting gatherings, remembering specific events, or curating traditions that others in the settlement respected. A further layer comes from possible ritual functions. Some images cluster around features like platforms with burials beneath, or around protruding bull horns and other installations. In those cases, painting could help frame rites of remembering, offerings, or seasonal activities. But here we start to move onto thinner ice. The temptation is strong to look at a painted wall with animals and abstract motifs and say shrine or temple room. The word feels familiar. It slots Çatalhöyük into categories we already recognize. That familiarity is precisely the danger. Much of the early interpretation of Çatalhöyük leaned heavily on comparisons to much later religions, goddess cults, fertility rites, temples in miniature. Today, many archaeologists are more cautious. They point out that we are dealing with people who lived between roughly 7,400 and 6,000 BCE in a social world very different from the Bronze Age cities and classical religions that tend to dominate our imagination. Projecting neatly formed pantheons or doctrinal systems backward onto these painted walls risks explaining away their strangeness. Instead, it may be more honest to say that the art at Çatalhöyük likely did several things at once. A painted wall could participate in telling stories, mark out a space as appropriate for certain activities, embody memories of particular animals or people, and also just make the room feel right according to local tastes. The same motif might mean slightly different things to different viewers, or its meaning might shift over generations as people replastered, repainted, and retold. The uneven distribution of paintings across the settlement is another important clue. Some rooms, often the main rooms with platforms and hearths, bear most of the imagery. Side rooms used for storage or more utilitarian tasks are usually bare. Even among main rooms, some are densely decorated while others show little beyond simple plastering. That pattern suggests that visual elaboration was a choice, not a requirement. Households decided at particular times to invest labour and scarce pigments in making their everyday surroundings visually and perhaps symbolically thick. Why did one house choose to put a dramatic animal scene near a burial platform, while a neighbour kept their walls plain? We do not yet have a satisfying single answer. It might relate to the age of the house, the number or kind of burials beneath it, the roles of its occupants in wider social networks, or events that mattered enough to call for a new layer of paint. It could also reflect differences in access to pigments, or in who within the community had the knowledge and the authority to paint in particular styles. What is clear is that colour and image were not background decoration. They were part of how people at Çatalhöyük made their rooms into meaningful places. Surrounded by the bones of their dead underfoot, the smells of food and smoke, and these carefully placed patches of red, black and patterned form on the walls, the inhabitants lived inside a kind of three-dimensional memory structure. The next step is to look at the other elements that shared those same rooms, the horns, platforms and sculpted features that blur the line between furniture, installation and altar. If paintings were the most fluid layer of meaning in a house at Çatalhöyük, the horns and built installations were the most stubborn. Again and again in the same kinds of rooms where people slept, cooked and buried their dead. Archaeologists find arrangements of animal parts made durable in mud brick and plaster. The most famous are the bucrania, modelled bull heads with real horns set into them. Sometimes the skull is actual bone, encased in plaster that restores flesh and muscle in exaggerated form. Sometimes the whole skull is sculpted from earth and lime, but the horns are still real, heavy, dangerous objects brought under control and fixed into the wall. Many of these installations cluster along the main walls of a room, often above or beside platforms. Some are freestanding, rising like low-horned pillars from the floor. In a few cases, entire walls become crowded with sets of horns, projecting into the space so densely that moving around them must have required care. Other rooms show a single prominent set of aurochs horns anchored into the plaster at eye level, dominating one side of the house. And it isn't just cattle. There are horn cores from wild sheep and goats, teeth and jaws from carnivores, sometimes arranged in deliberate groupings, sometimes embedded into plastered benches or wall projections. In one building, a row of rams' heads was modelled in relief, each with its own horns. In another, the four parts of animals seemed to emerge from the wall itself, as if the house were halfway in the process of turning into an animal, or the animal into a piece of architecture. Archaeologists refer to many of these as installations because they are not removable like loose objects. They are part of the building's bones, but that label doesn't tell us what they were for. Older interpretations leaned quickly toward shrines. A room with many horned bucrania, a few burials, and some vivid painting looked to mid-20th century eyes like an early version of a temple. Perhaps, the argument ran, these were domestic chapels for a bull deity or a fertility cult, with horns as trophies of successful hunts or sacrifices. There may be pieces of truth in those ideas, but the picture that has emerged over decades is more tangled. For one thing, the same rooms with elaborate bucrania also show clear evidence of everyday life: hearths, storage bins, grinding stones, food remains. The shrine was also the kitchen, the bedroom, the place where children played and elders slept. There is no sharp architectural boundary where ritual ends and domesticity begins. For another, horns and other installations change over time within a single house. As at least some buildings were rebuilt on the same footprint for generations, walls raised down, floors raised, new platforms added, later residents sometimes kept the same general scheme of horned features, sometimes altered it, and sometimes buried earlier installations under fresh plaster. A pair of horns might be carefully removed and reinstalled, or deliberately entombed in a platform, creating what archaeologists call curated deposits, assemblies of meaningful materials, horns, skulls, tools, pigments, placed together in pits, niches, or under floors, and then sealed. These curated deposits blur categories even further. They are not rubbish dumps. They lack the random mix of broken everyday debris. They are also not quite burials, except in the broadest sense. They look more like intentional packages of material memory, parts of animals, fragments of earlier architecture, bits of stone or pigment, all gathered and put away at particular moments in the life of the house. Maybe when a person died, maybe when a wall was rebuilt, maybe at seasonal intervals we no longer recognize. Here, the question of rebuilding takes on a different tone. Çatalhöyük houses were not left to decay naturally and then replaced elsewhere. Again and again, people chose to tear down and rebuild on the same spot, raising the mound metre by metre over centuries between roughly 7,400 and 6,000 BCE. Each new floor sealed in the old one, along with its burials, its installations, its deposits. The act of rebuilding may itself have been a kind of ceremony, a moment when the living negotiated their relationship to the dead, to their own past, and to the animals and materials that had sustained them. Was there a specific ritual sequence? We do not know. Excavators can see patterns, horns removed and buried before a new floor goes in, plaster installations cut away and replaced, sequences of repainting that culminate in a final ceiling layer, but they cannot hear the words or see the gestures that went with them. Some researchers imagine formal house closing rites and house opening rites. Others prefer to speak more cautiously of socially meaningful maintenance, regularized practices that carried emotional weight without necessarily forming a codified religion. Either way, the boundary between sacred and ordinary blurs almost completely. Grinding grain might happen beside a wall studded with bull horns. Children might grow up tracing cracks in the plaster beneath a row of modelled animal heads, whose original stories only older relatives remembered. A meal could be eaten sitting on a platform that covered both human burials and a carefully arranged cache of horns and tools from a previous generation. Instead of thinking in terms of separate zones, a temple over here, a house over there. We may need to imagine that for Çatalhöyük's inhabitants, the house itself was the primary sacred space. Not sacred in opposition to everyday life, but sacred because everyday life, death, memory and animal power were all folded into it. That raises a final question. What does it mean for a large, dense settlement to have so much of its symbolic and possibly ritual life located inside individual houses, rather than in a central monument or public square? One mainstream interpretation is that Çatalhöyük represents a world where ritual authority was dispersed. Each household maintained its own relationship to ancestors and powerful animals, expressed in its own installations, burials and deposits. Some houses, the history houses with especially dense sequences of rebuilding and decoration, may have taken on a heavier ritual load, becoming important places for wider groups. But there is still no single dominant temple to stand in for the whole community. Another possibility is that what looks to us like ritual was, to them, simply what it meant to maintain a proper house. Honouring the dead, setting horns in plaster, reburying old features, repainting walls, these might have felt less like visits to a separate sacred institution and more like deep cleaning and renovation, tasks that kept the world in order. The unresolved questions remain large. Did certain lineages or specialists control knowledge about how to install horns or arrange deposits? Were there stories that linked particular animal installations to myths of origin or migration? Or were these practices more open, part of a shared repertoire that most adults could participate in? For now, the evidence supports caution. We can say that horns, modelled heads, platforms and curated deposits stitched together animals, ancestors and architecture in ways that mattered deeply. We can see that houses were rebuilt in ways that preserved continuity, even as they covered and transformed the past. And we can infer that in this streetless city, sacred space was not lifted out of daily life and set apart. It was distributed, multiplied and layered into the very places where people slept, ate and grew old. If each house was its own small world of memory, animals and ancestors, the next question almost asks itself, who, if anyone, was in charge of all this? By the time Çatalhöyük reached its peak, perhaps around 7,000, 6,500 BCE, thousands of people were living on that mound. Packed houses, generations of rebuilding, elaborate installations, long-distance trade, complex burial practices. In most later periods of history, when we see that kind of density and organization, we expect to find certain familiar signatures: a big building that looks like a palace, a temple complex raised above ordinary roofs, special tombs for important people loaded with rare goods. At Çatalhöyük, those signatures are strangely muted. There is no towering central monument on the excavated parts of the East Mound. No stone-lined royal grave with gold or copper or carved ivory. No obvious council house that dwarfs its neighbours. From above, the settlement looks like a relatively uniform carpet of similar-sized rectangles, each one a house much like the next. That doesn't automatically mean there was no hierarchy. Archaeologists have learned to be cautious here. Power can hide in plain sight. It can take forms that do not require giant buildings or lavish burials. So, instead of looking for kings and temples, researchers look for subtler indicators of inequality. One of the first is house size and layout. In more clearly stratified ancient cities, wealthier families often live in larger, more complex structures: extra rooms, private courtyards, storage wings. At Çatalhöyük there is variation, but it is not stark. Some buildings are a bit bigger, some platforms more elaborate, some walls more frequently replastered and painted. A few so-called history houses accumulate more burials and installations over time. Yet the overall range is surprisingly tight. We do not see a handful of enormous compounds towering over clusters of tiny huts. Another indicator is grave goods. When some people are buried with rich ornaments and exotic objects while others get little or nothing, that often points to fixed social ranks. Under the floors of Çatalhöyük houses, burials do sometimes contain items: beads, carved stone objects, obsidian blades, shell jewellery, occasionally more unusual pieces like marble figurines. But the pattern is complex. Children, including infants, can be buried with many beads or a striking object, while some adults receive very little. Items we might instinctively read as prestige goods are not confined to a small, easily defined elite. They are scattered, uneven, and embedded in family histories that do not map neatly onto a simple class system. Diet offers another window. If higher status people consistently eat more meat or higher quality foods, that can show up in their bones and teeth. Isotopic analysis, looking at the chemical signatures locked into skeletons, can reveal differences in what people ate over their lifetimes. At Çatalhöyük, the results so far suggest broad similarity. Most individuals seem to have drawn on the same mix of cereals, pulses, and animal protein. There are hints of variation. Some people may have eaten slightly more meat, others more plant foods, but nothing as sharp as the divide between, say, palace residents and field labourers in later societies. Then there is trauma and workload. In deeply unequal societies, the bodies of the poor often bear more marks of chronic stress, heavy labour footprints in the spine and joints, more untreated fractures, higher rates of malnutrition in childhood. Çatalhöyük's skeletons do show considerable wear and tear. Many people had spine and joint degeneration consistent with grinding grain or carrying loads. Healed fractures are common, but again the pattern does not split cleanly into one group doing all the hard work and another avoiding it. Both males and females show evidence of strenuous activity. Heavy labour seems to have been widely shared. Access to exotic materials is another clue. Obsidian from Cappadocia, shells from the Mediterranean, rare pigments, unusual stone. In a strongly hierarchical system, control over such resources can be tightly held by a small group. At Çatalhöyük, these materials move through many houses. Some buildings contain more imported items than others, but the distribution is broad enough that archaeologists speak of networks of exchange rather than a monopoly. If there were gatekeepers of trade, their grip was not absolute in the archaeological record we can see. All of this has led many researchers to a cautious but intriguing hypothesis. Perhaps Çatalhöyük was, by the standards of later cities, relatively egalitarian. That does not mean everyone was the same, or that no one held authority. Differences still show up in how often certain houses were rebuilt, in the density of burials and installations, in the frequency of repainting, in the presence of special objects like plastered skulls or particularly elaborate horn arrangements. Some buildings look like they mattered more within local social landscapes. They may have anchored lineages, held important memories, or hosted gatherings beyond the immediate household. Leadership, if it existed, might have been tied to these history houses, to seniority, ritual knowledge, or control over stories and practices rather than to wealth in the usual material sense. A respected elder, a skilled healer, a person known for managing horn installations or burial rites could hold significant influence without leaving behind a palace. Gender complicates the picture further. Figurines from Çatalhöyük include both male and female forms, though later fame has focused heavily on a few corpulent female figures that were once dubbed goddesses. Skeletal evidence shows that both men and women engaged in difficult physical work, though perhaps not identical tasks. Decorated burials include individuals of different ages and apparently different sexes. There is no simple, consistent pattern where one gender is always associated with richer grave goods or more prominent burial locations. This has prompted some scholars to suggest that gender roles at Çatalhöyük may have been more flexible than in many later agrarian societies. Others advise restraint, noting that symbolism, clothing, and daily interactions, crucial to understanding gender and power, leave only faint traces in the archaeological record. It is safer to say that we do not yet see strong, unambiguous evidence of one gender systematically dominating the other in material terms. Taken together, these strands point to something important. Çatalhöyük does not fit comfortably with the old assumption that once you get a large, dense settlement, you must get kings, temples, and sharply stratified classes. Here, thousands of people lived in close proximity for more than a millennium without building a ziggurat, a throne room, or a walled royal cemetery, at least in the areas so far excavated. Their symbolic life seems to have been anchored in houses, not in a central cult. Their access to food and crafted goods appears broadly shared, with differences but not rigid castes. That does not make Çatalhöyük a utopia, and it does not mean conflict or inequality were absent. Power can be quiet. It can flow through age, knowledge, kinship, and subtle control over ritual practice. It can be negotiated within and between households in ways that rarely leave dramatic archaeological markers. But the settlement does force a reconsideration. Maybe early large communities did not always crystallize around strong chiefs and centralized institutions. Maybe one path to city-scale living, at least for a time, ran through dense networks of households, shared practices, and distributed ritual authority, rather than through palaces and streets. If so, that has implications for how life felt inside this streetless city, especially when we turn to the more difficult side of that density, the pressures on bodies, health, and minds that come with living so close together for so long. Living that close together with no streets and very little open space came with a price. From a distance, Çatalhöyük can feel almost abstract, a pattern of rectangles, a fascinating experiment in egalitarian living. Up close at the scale of bodies and lungs and skin, it was probably intense. Archaeologists sometimes talk about population density in neutral terms, but for the people who actually lived there, density meant air, smells, noise, and disease. The houses were warm, enclosed, and repeatedly rebuilt on the same footprints. Hearths burned indoors, animals were butchered inside. People slept, ate, worked, and died in the same rooms. Beneath the platforms where they sat and slept, earlier generations were buried. On the roofs and in whatever small open spaces existed between structures, daily waste had to go somewhere. We do not find a neat grid of latrines or a hidden sewer system. Instead, there are midden areas, dumping grounds on the edges of the mound, and in small pockets between buildings. These contain animal bones, broken tools, ash, and domestic refuse, along with the kinds of materials that attract parasites and vermin. Microscopic analysis of soil samples from around Çatalhöyük has revealed parasite eggs, including those associated with intestinal worms. That suggests that at least some of the time, human and animal waste was not separated as thoroughly as modern sanitation would require. Add animals to this picture and the health risks become clearer. By around 6,500 BCE, the people of Çatalhöyük were herding sheep and goats, and probably keeping some cattle. These animals were slaughtered and processed within the settlement. Some may have been kept close to the houses at times, even if their main grazing grounds lay outside. Proximity to domesticated animals can provide reliable protein and secondary products like milk and hides. It can also create new disease ecologies, many infectious diseases that later become familiar in cities, various parasites, zoonotic infections that jump between species, find more stable footholds when people, their waste and their animals are concentrated in one place. While we cannot diagnose specific epidemics at Çatalhöyük with certainty, the environmental setup is one that would have increased the background risk of infection and reinfection. The skeletons preserve traces of these pressures. Many individuals show signs of physiological stress during childhood. Enamel, hyperplasia, defects in tooth enamel that form when growth is disrupted, appears in teeth from Çatalhöyük, indicating episodes when children's bodies were struggling, likely due to illness, malnutrition, or both. Some bones carry evidence of mild anemia, visible as porous changes in skull and eye socket bones, which can be linked to nutritional deficiencies or chronic infections, including those from parasites. There are also indicators of respiratory strain. Living in enclosed smoky spaces comes with a cost. Soot particles and constant exposure to indoor fires can irritate lungs and eyes. In some skeletal remains, researchers have found patterns consistent with chronic irritation of the respiratory system. Add to that the fine dust of a dry Anatolian plain, stirred up by thousands of feet and by grinding grain day after day, and breathing at Çatalhöyük may often have been a struggle. Joints and bones tell their own quiet story of wear. Spinal degeneration, joint damage in knees and hips, and changes in arm and shoulder bones suggest repetitive, heavy tasks performed over many years. Grinding grain on large stone querns is a particularly demanding activity, often linked to characteristic patterns of wear in shoulders, elbows, and vertebrae. These marks appear in both male and female skeletons, implying that the labour of keeping a dense community supplied with flour, firewood, water, and building materials was widely shared. Then there is trauma. Broken bones, some healed, some less so, occur with notable frequency. Many fractures are consistent with falls, perhaps from roofs or ladders. In a city with no streets where roofs doubled as thoroughfares and workspaces, a misstep on a frosty morning or during a crowded gathering could have serious consequences. Other injuries could relate to accidents with tools, animals, or heavy loads. A more delicate question is interpersonal violence. Some skeletons at Çatalhöyük show cranial trauma and other injuries that might result from blows rather than from simple accidents. A few individuals exhibit multiple head wounds, including some that had healed and others that were fatal. Interpreting this is tricky. A community of several thousand people over many centuries will generate a certain amount of conflict, whether in the form of domestic disputes, ritualized fighting, or rare episodes of more organized violence. What we do not see, at least so far, is the kind of overwhelming pattern associated with chronic warfare or systematic massacre, mass graves filled with unburied bodies, weapons lodged widely in bones, large portions of the population killed at once. Instead, the picture is mixed. Life at Çatalhöyük involved risk and occasional trauma, but the dominant signal is one of daily strain rather than constant battle. In that context, cooperation was not optional. It was a survival strategy. Keeping disease at bay in such density would have required shared rules, formal or informal, around cleanliness and disposal of waste. Ash from hearths could be used to cover organic matter, slowing decay and smell. Certain areas could be designated for dumping refuse, keeping it away from main roof paths and house entrances. Repeated replastering of walls and floors, which we know happened frequently, did not just refresh the look of a room, it may also have sealed in older layers of dirt and potential pathogens. Households likely developed routines for sweeping platforms, managing fire, and controlling smoke as much as possible. Simple habits: where to put scraps, how to handle butchered remains, when to repair cracks where insects might nest, could cumulatively make a real difference. In a settlement with no central sanitation authority, these practices would have depended on shared norms and mutual expectations. Social ties may have cushioned other pressures too. When someone fell from a roof or suffered a serious fracture, the fact that many injuries show signs of healing suggests that care was available. People with impaired mobility lived long enough for bones to knit, which implies that others brought them food, tended fires, and helped with daily tasks. Infections and childhood illnesses would have swept through tight clusters of houses, but they would also have happened in a community where knowledge of remedies, care practices, and protective rituals could circulate quickly. All of this brings us back to the question of density itself. Was packing houses so tightly a forced response to limited space or dangers outside the mound? Was it about defense, proximity to fields and water, or minimizing the loss of arable land to buildings? Or was there also a cultural preference at work, a sense that living close to kin, ancestors, and shared installations was simply how life ought to be organized? It may have been some mix of all three: practical necessity, environmental logic, and deeply held ideas about where people belonged in relation to one another, to animals and to the dead beneath the floors. Whatever the reasons, the cost of living close was real, written in parasites, enamel lines, worn joints, and broken bones. Yet people stayed for centuries, rebuilding house on house, layer on layer. That persistence suggests that, despite the health burdens, density also offered something powerful, something that made this crowded, smoky, demanding place worth the risks. To understand what that something might have been, we have to step back once more and ask a broader question. Not just how Çatalhöyük worked, or how it felt to live inside it, but what role a settlement like this played in the story of early farming societies. In other words, what was this streetless city really for? Asking what Çatalhöyük was for can be a bit misleading, because it assumes there was a single purpose, a clear design brief everyone agreed on. For the people who built and rebuilt this mound between roughly 7,400 and 6,000 BCE, it was probably many things at once. It was home in the most literal sense, the place where you were born, where your teeth first broke through, where you learned to crawl on plastered floors and climb ladders to the roof. It was memory, layered vertically. Each rebuilt house sealed away an earlier phase of life. Old hearths, old wall paintings, older burials, turning architecture into a physical archive of family history. It was economy. Grain stored in bins and baskets, animals herded in and out of the surrounding landscape, obsidian blades traded, used, sharpened, and retrained. Workflows moved through these houses as surely as smoke did. Grinding, weaving, flint knapping, butchering, cooking, repairing. And it was identity. The decorations on walls, the horns set into platforms, the particular ways bodies were buried under certain spots in certain rooms, all pointed to shared ideas about who we are and what a proper house, a proper life should look like. It was also ritual, but not necessarily in the sense of a separate sacred district with temples and priests. At Çatalhöyük, the strongest evidence for ritual activity sits inside houses. Plastered bull heads, repeated painting, and replastering of particular walls, burials placed under key platforms, sometimes revisited when new bodies were added. Whatever ceremonies took place seemed to have been woven into domestic space rather than removed from it. When archaeologists try to step back and classify all of this, several labels come up. One is proto-city. By later standards, Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, classical Athens. Çatalhöyük lacks many urban features. There are no clear public buildings, no palace or temple towering above the rest, no visible streets. Yet the population size, density, and longevity of occupation are striking. For centuries, thousands of people lived in close proximity, coordinating building practices, managing shared resources, and maintaining long-distance exchange networks that brought obsidian and exotic materials from far beyond the Konya plain. In that sense, Çatalhöyük does look like an early experiment in urban-scale living before formal institutions, writing, or monumental architecture. Another interpretation sees it as a very large village, a cluster of households bound by kinship ties and local norms, scaled up but still operating on a fundamentally domestic logic. There is some support for this. House sizes are relatively similar. Dramatic differences in wealth are hard to pin down, and many activities that would later be handled in public spaces, rituals, storage, craft production, were distributed through homes. From this angle, Çatalhöyük is what happens when you take the Neolithic village model and push it to its maximum intensity. A third view emphasizes aggregation. Perhaps Çatalhöyük was a place where smaller groups periodically came together to exchange marriage partners, trade goods, reaffirm social ties, and participate in collective rituals. On this reading, the mound might not have been equally full all year round. Population could swell seasonally, especially during key moments in the agricultural cycle, and thin out when people dispersed to smaller hamlets and field camps. Related to that is the idea of Çatalhöyük as a kind of network hub. Its position in central Anatolia, its access to obsidian sources, and the variety of non-local materials found there suggest it was plugged into trade and information routes stretching over hundreds of kilometers. People might have come not only for kin-based reasons, but because this was where you could access specialized crafts, exchange news, or participate in shared ritual traditions that helped knit a wider region together. All of these models may capture part of the truth. What they share is the recognition that Çatalhöyük was not a random heap of houses. Its very shape, the dense agglomeration, the lack of ground-level streets, the use of rooftops as circulation routes, seems to have been a social technology as much as an architectural quirk. Building wall against wall and moving across roofs does certain things to how people live together. It reduces the amount of open space that needs to be defended or managed. It concentrates entrances up on the roof where you can see who is approaching and control access with a ladder rather than a door onto a street. It keeps the footprint of the settlement compact, preserving more surrounding land for fields, grazing and wild resources. But it also shapes social experience. Daily movement pulls you up and out onto the shared roofscape. You see neighbours, hear their conversations, notice who is grinding grain, who is butchering an animal, who is repainting a wall. News, gossip, techniques and stories travel along those flat surfaces as people walk from house to house. Privacy and exposure are negotiated vertically, not horizontally. Even the decision not to carve out formal streets may have been meaningful. Streets, as they appear in later cities, tend to create strong distinctions between inside and outside, between household and public. At Çatalhöyük, with circulation happening on the roof and activities spilling across thresholds, that boundary was softer. The layout may have helped maintain a social world in which households were distinct but deeply entangled, where no single central square or avenue defined the community. When we sift through the evidence, a few things stand out strongly. This was a long-lived, dense settlement that combined farming, herding, and hunting. It maintained connections to distant sources of obsidian and other materials. Houses were repeatedly rebuilt on the same spots, with careful attention to internal layouts and ritual installations. Burials and symbolic features were concentrated within domestic spaces. Clear, large-scale markers of centralized political or religious authority are hard to find. At the same time, the unknowns remain large. We do not yet fully understand how leadership worked, how decisions were made about building, waste management, or conflict resolution. We do not know exactly how many people were present at any given season, or how often individuals moved in and out. We can see patterns in house size, burial counts, and decorative richness, but interpreting these as status or rank is still debated, and we cannot, from bones and plaster alone, reconstruct the stories people told themselves about why they lived this way. Before we keep going, a quick note for those who like diving deeper into this kind of slow, evidence-based history. There's a Sleepy Time history book that explores long arcs of human past in the same calm, careful style as this episode. If you'd like something to read before bed or to fall asleep to, it's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. When we return to Çatalhöyük with all of this in mind, the question, what was it for, starts to feel less like a puzzle with one missing piece, and more like an invitation to rethink what early dense settlements could be. Not necessarily the first city as we imagine cities now, but a different kind of experiment. A place where home, memory, economy, identity and ritual were folded into the same tight cluster of rooms stacked on top of their own past. And then, after many centuries, people changed their minds. They began to leave, to scatter, to build differently. To see what that shift might mean, we have to follow them out of the mound and into the wider landscape, where the legacy of a streetless city continued in new forms. When archaeologists talk about Çatalhöyük ending, it is easy to imagine a dramatic moment, fire on the rooftops, enemies at the edge of the mound, some disaster that turns life off like a switch. The actual story, so far as we can see it, looks slower and more ambiguous. Occupation at the eastern mound seems to thin out after around 6,200, 6,000 BCE. Some houses are carefully closed, floors cleaned, certain installations dismantled, entrances sealed. Others look more abrupt, with ash, debris and discarded objects left in place. A western mound nearby continues to be occupied for a little longer, but even there, the density never again reaches the intense packing of the classic Çatalhöyük levels. There is no obvious layer of destruction across the site. No thick band of ash that would signal a massive fire, no scatter of weapons or mass graves that would scream invasion. Instead, we see a gradual change in how often houses are rebuilt, in how many burials are placed beneath them, in how carefully walls are replastered and repainted. The old pattern of intense renewal, of house on house on house, starts to loosen. Why? Several factors line up as possible contributors, but none yet stands alone as the answer. One is environmental. Around the mid-7th millennium BCE, the wider region seems to undergo shifts in rainfall patterns and water availability. The Konya Plain, which had once hosted wetlands and marshes, appears to have been changing. Pollen records and sediment cores hint at alterations in vegetation and local hydrology. If the wetlands that supported hunting, reed gathering, and perhaps seasonal grazing were shrinking or moving, the advantages of staying tightly clustered around the mound might have begun to diminish. A second factor is resource use closer to home. Centuries of intensive occupation, burning and construction would have affected nearby wood sources, soils, and grazing areas. Even with careful management, a settlement of several thousand people concentrates demand. There are hints in later levels of changes in fuel use, possibly a turn to dung or lower quality wood. That might reflect adaptation, or it might signal that the easy resources had already been taken. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, there are signs of social reorganization in the wider region. By the time Çatalhöyük is starting to thin, other Neolithic and early Chalcolithic settlements in central Anatolia show different ways of living. Some communities are smaller and more dispersed, with clear open spaces, lanes or proto-streets carved between houses. Others experiment with freestanding buildings that are not locked into wall-against-wall blocks. It looks as if the Çatalhöyük way of being dense and streetless is no longer the only, or even the dominant path. People are still farming, still herding, still building in mud brick, but the social landscapes they are creating for themselves are changing. Smaller villages, more separated households, perhaps more obvious communal spaces begin to appear. It is possible that some families from Çatalhöyük simply moved outward into this emerging network of newer style settlements. They did not have to travel far. The Konya Plain and surrounding regions offered plenty of room for experiments in layout and land use. The skills honed in the mound, plastering, building, farming, obsidian working would have been portable. The densely layered house sequences end, but the knowledge does not. There may also have been internal pressures. Living in that kind of close-packed environment has costs. Earlier we looked at crowding, disease, and the challenges of smoke, waste, and limited interior light. Over generations, people might have come to value a bit more horizontal space, a bit more separation between households, new ways of marking boundaries, and shared areas. The pull of the mound's traditions, the obligation to rebuild on the same footprint, to bury under the same platforms, could have started to feel more like a weight than an anchor for some. None of these possibilities rules out others. Climate variation, resource stress, shifting trade routes, internal social change, new religious ideas, even localized conflict could all have played some role. The archaeological record gives us patterns, but not motives. We see that the tight fabric of Çatalhöyük slowly relaxes, that building ceases, that the mound gradually turns from a living roofscape into a silent hill. We do not yet hear the conversations in which people decided to go, and yet, even in its ending, Çatalhöyük quietly disrupts the standard narrative of civilization. For a long time the story went like this. First small villages, then larger towns, then true cities marked by streets, public squares, temples, palaces, governments, and eventually writing and law codes. Complexity in that model is almost synonymous with hierarchy and with sharply separated public and private spaces. Çatalhöyük reminds us that there was another path. Here is a settlement that for more than 1,000 years sustained a population on an urban scale. It coordinated farming, herding, and long-distance exchange. It maintained complex ritual traditions, elaborate house biographies, and fine-grained divisions of space within buildings. But it did this without the things we typically use to identify cities. No monumental temples, no obvious administrative quarter, no planned street grid radiating from a central square. Complexity does not automatically produce rulers' palaces. Dense living does not automatically generate wide avenues and formal public buildings. At Çatalhöyük, the engines of social life seem to have remained inside houses and across their rooftops, in domestic rituals and kin groups, in informal networks of cooperation and exchange. That does not mean the community was simple or egalitarian in any modern sense. Some houses have more burials, more elaborate wall art, more installations. Access to obsidian, to certain animal parts, to particular ritual roles may well have been unevenly distributed. There might have been leaders, specialists, or influential lineages whose authority simply does not show up as a separate building on a plan. What it does mean is that the link between civilization and certain architectural forms is less tight than we sometimes imagine. You can have longevity, density, rich symbolism, and far-flung connections without streets, plazas, or visible bureaucracies. You can have a deeply structured social world that is written into small rooms and repeated house plans, rather than carved into monumental stone. This is part of why Çatalhöyük remains so resistant to a neat conclusion. The dataset is unusually rich. Thousands of excavated features, human remains, animal bones, microscopic residues on floors and tools. We can reconstruct diets, track changes in hearth technology, map where people knelt to grind grain and where they slept. We can see patterns in who was buried where and how often walls were repainted. And yet the big categories we tend to reach for, city, village, temple, state, chiefdom, keep slipping when we try to fit them tightly over the mound. Each captures something, none feels complete. Was this place an early city? A hypertrophied village? A ritual aggregation site? A regional hub? It may have been all of these at different times, or all at once in different ways. Living with that ambiguity is part of the lesson. Çatalhöyük invites us to hold evidence and wonder together to trace the very concrete details of plaster, bone and grain, while accepting that the meanings people attach to those things are not fully accessible to us. It asks us to be comfortable with a past that is legible in its traces, but still open-ended in its interpretation. As we move toward a final reflection, we can carry that with us. This mound on the Konya Plain does not give us a clear origin story of cities, or of inequality, or of religion. Instead, it offers something quieter, but in some ways more useful. An example of how humans once chose to live densely and cooperatively without streets, without obvious rulers, and without many of the institutions we take for granted. In the last section, we'll sit with that example and ask what a streetless city, long abandoned yet still speaking through its layers, might have to say to the way we build and inhabit our own worlds now. When you think back across Çatalhöyük now, let the noise fall away for a moment. Beneath the debates about city or village, about hierarchy or equality, there are a few solid threads we can actually hold. We know that this was a place where movement ran across the tops of houses rather than between them. For more than 1,000 years, people stepped out onto packed earth rooftops, crossed their neighbours' ceilings, and climbed down ladders into rooms that were part home, part shrine, part tomb. Circulation was vertical and shared. The outside public space was not a street, but a continuous surface of roofs. We know that life was intensely house-centred, cooking, sleeping, tool-making, storytelling, the renewal of plaster, the repainting of walls, the tending of hearths, all folded into these rectangular boxes, rebuilt again and again on the same footprints. Whatever larger networks existed, the immediate frame of meaning seems to have been the household and its ancestors, its own sequence of floors and walls and memories. We know that the dead remained quite literally underfoot. Bodies were placed beneath platforms where people sat and worked, beneath beds where they slept. Children and adults, men and women, sometimes gathered in clusters, sometimes widely spaced. Skulls were occasionally removed and later reburied. These are not abstract theories, they are bones in the ground, cut by trowels, measured and recorded. Whatever else Çatalhöyük was, it was a place where the living and dead occupied the same architectural body. We know that colour and image mattered. The red ochre washes, the repeated animal forms, the geometric compositions, the horned installations and modelled reliefs are not accidents. They took time and skill. Some houses carry layer upon layer of repainting and reworking, suggesting that certain rooms were repeatedly chosen as stages for marking and remaking meaning. Beyond that, the ground grows softer. Was there an organised priesthood, or were rituals distributed among households? Were some lineages quietly dominant, or did influence shift with age, skill, and circumstance? Did everyone share broadly similar beliefs, or did interpretations of those painted walls vary from family to family, generation to generation? The evidence lets us draw boundaries around what is likely. We do not see palaces, written decrees, or clear administrative buildings. We do see differences between houses, uneven concentrations of burials and art, hints of specialized knowledge. Within those constraints, multiple reconstructions are possible, and at the moment, none can claim to be final. Staying close to what the data can bear is part of the discipline, and also part of the wonder. Çatalhöyük reminds us that the past is not there to confirm our favourite stories about progress or decline. It is there as a set of traces, stubborn and partial, that resist being folded too neatly into any single narrative. So perhaps the quiet lesson of this streetless city is this: complex, dense, symbol-rich human life does not have to look like our modern idea of a city. It can be woven through rooftops instead of avenues, through private rooms instead of public squares, through shared obligations to houses and ancestors instead of obedience to distant institutions. People can coordinate farming, herding, craft, and long-distance exchange without leaving us the kinds of monuments we usually look for. As you drift away from the Konya plain and back toward your own world of roads, screens, and bright electric light, you might carry that possibility with you. There have always been other ways to inhabit the same planet. Çatalhöyük is one of the oldest we can still half hear. If you've enjoyed wandering through